June 29, 1692. Dawn should have brought the news.
Instead, 9 condemned women disappeared from a bolted iron-barred cell.
No broken lock. No footprints in the mud.
Only 9 wooden spoons laid in perfect silence, and hair still warm, freshly cut, as if the devil himself had lingered to collect his price. What really happened in that cellar between midnight and first light has haunted New England bloodlines for over 3 centuries. The heavy oak door of the Salem jail cellar groaned on its hinges that morning, but the sound carried no triumph, only a hollow, unnatural quiet. Jailer George Corwin stood frozen in the threshold, lantern light trembling in his grip. The cell that should have held 9 terrified, chained women awaiting the gallows at dawn was empty. Not a single iron ring disturbed. The ankle chains lay coiled on the damp stone floor like shed snakeskin. The narrow slit of a window, barely wide enough for a child's arm, remained sealed with its original bars. The door had been bolted from the outside exactly as he had left it.
Yet the women were gone.
On the cold center of the floor rested 9 wooden spoons, arranged with eerie precision in a single straight line. Beside them, a small pile of human hair, dark and light strands tangled together, still carried the faint warmth of living scalps. When the constable later touched it, he recoiled as though burned.
The hair was wet. Not with water.
With something thicker. Something that smelled faintly of iron and prayer. Reverend Nicholas Noyes arrived moments later to offer final spiritual comfort before the executions. What he found stole the breath from his lungs. He fell to his knees right there on the filthy stone, whispering the 91st Psalm under his breath, but the words felt empty in that forsaken space.
This was no ordinary escape. This was something older.
Something that smelled of sin, land hunger, and a bargain struck in the dark hours when God's face turns away.
The Commonwealth of Massachusetts would never officially acknowledge what occurred between midnight and 5 in the morning on June 28 to 29, 1692. The names of the 9 women were quietly erased from the execution rolls.
Most modern histories claim they were never even charged. But in a sealed box deep in the Essex County archives, marked only with the date and the single-word incident, lie fragments of letters, partial depositions, and one blood-stained page that
tells a far more disturbing truth. A truth of 3 desperate men in a cellar.
A truth of 9 women who chose something worse than the rope. A truth that still binds certain families of New England to silence more than 300 years later.
Before we descend into that night, if you're the kind of soul drawn to America's buried sins and the spiritual shadows that still cling to them, do me a favor right now, subscribe and ring that bell. Drop in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Let's walk through this darkness together. To understand what truly happened inside that cell, we must first walk the muddy roads of Salem Village in the spring of 1692. Not the charming tourist Salem of today with its shops and memorials. No. This was a raw, wind-bitten farming parish of roughly 550 souls, locked in a grinding civil war with the wealthier port of Salem town just a few miles away. For nearly 20 years the village had begged for independence, its own meeting house, its own minister, its own taxes. Salem town refused. The resentment festered like an open wound. Out of this bitterness rose 2 warring factions that would tear the community apart. On one side stood the Putnam family and their western upland allies, hardscrabble farmers watching their modest fortunes bleed away while Atlantic trade enriched the eastern merchants. On the other, the Porter family and their connections to Salem town's shipping wealth, Boston, and the new mercantile order. These 2 clans fought over everything: church pews, boundary lines, ministerial salaries, even who could graze cattle where. Children were taught which paths to avoid. Women knew which neighbors to shun on the Sabbath. Men carried clubs after dark, not for wolves, but for other men bearing the same last name. It was into this poisoned atmosphere that the storm broke inside the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris. His young daughter Betty and niece Abigail began writhing on the kitchen floor, screaming in voices that did not belong to them. Deep, scraping, guttural sounds that seemed to emerge from behind their teeth. They complained of invisible pins, bites, and blows. Red welts appeared on their skin. When pressed, they named the first 3 tormentors: Tituba, the enslaved woman from Barbados who lived under their own roof, Sarah Good, the foul-mouthed beggar, and Sarah Osborne, the scandalous widow who had married beneath her station. What began with 2 girls soon consumed the village like wildfire in dry grass. More girls joined the circle of accusers. Spectral evidence, the claim that the accused could torment victims through invisible spirit forms, was accepted by magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. This decision had no basis in English common law. It was a theological and legal catastrophe. By June, over 150 people languished in jails across Essex County. The air in Salem's makeshift prison, a converted 2-story house on Prison Lane, was beyond description. The cellar, where the worst cases were kept, was a pit of despair. Moisture wept constantly down the stone walls. The floor was half-packed earth, half stone, and the seam bred rats the size of small cats. The stench was a living thing: human waste, rotting straw, stagnant water, and something sweeter, more intimate, and far more terrible. Prisoners were chained not just to each other but to iron rings driven into the walls on the direct order of Magistrate Hathorne, who feared witches could fly in spectral form through solid matter. The women were stripped and searched for witch marks, any mole, birthmark, or protuberance that might suckle a familiar spirit. These examinations, performed by women who had once been their friends, their wedding attendants, their fellow mourners, lasted hours. The accused were returned to the cellar half-naked, humiliated, and broken. Some prayed. Some wept. Some simply stared at the dripping ceiling with eyes that had already seen hell. The 9 women who occupied that particular cell on the night of June 28 were not the most famous names. They were something far more dangerous, respectable women of property. Mary Osgood, 55, wife of a militia captain. Hannah Carrier, 38, daughter of the formidable Martha Carrier. Abigail Faulkner, 33, visibly pregnant, daughter of a minister. Martha Emerson, Sarah Cloyce, sister of the saintly Rebecca Nurse, Mary Toothaker, Rebecca Eames, Deliverance Hobbs, who had confessed and then recanted, and one final name so violently scratched from the record that the parchment itself was torn. Every single one of them came from families holding contested land along the disputed boundary between Salem Village and Andover. Everyone had either refused to sell to Putnam agents or had formally protested the latest surveys. Their arrests were never truly about witchcraft. They were about clearing title to rich farmland through accusation and execution. The spiritual weight of this cannot be overstated. In Puritan theology, false witness was not merely a crime, it was a sin that cried out to heaven. To bear false witness leading to the death of the innocent was to invite divine retribution upon one's bloodline. And yet greed proved stronger than fear of God. The night of June 28 was a Tuesday. A heavy summer storm had rolled in off the Atlantic that afternoon, turning the roads into sucking mud. By nightfall the village was dark except for the occasional flicker of rushlight. Frogs chorused loudly from the marshes. The air smelled of wet pine, salt, and something electric ozone mixed with dread. Jailer George Corwin, cousin to the magistrate, was on duty with 2 constables, Joseph Herrick, a pious family man, and young John Putnam Jr. They had been drinking from a large stoneware jug of cider delivered mysteriously that afternoon. No one would later remember who ordered it or who paid. The tavern records for that month would conveniently burn. Around 11 o'clock, the cider took a strange effect. Not ordinary drunkenness. Corwin described a terrible heaviness in his limbs, a humming in his ears like distant chanting, and the sensation that his hands were wrapped in wet wool. His tongue swelled. Words came out slow and distorted. Young Putnam vomited violently in the garden, then sat weeping uncontrollably, remembering his dead mother. Herrick alone seemed to retain some presence of mind, yet even he later swore he heard women's voices singing low hymns from the cellar, hymns that turned into something else. Something older. Something that made the hair on his arms rise. What happened next in that cellar has been pieced together from fragments, nightmares passed down through certain families, and the few documents that escaped the purge. 9 desperate women, facing the gallows at dawn, made a choice. Not to escape through physical means, but to step across a threshold that no Christian soul should ever approach. They had nothing left to lose but their eternal souls, and in that moment, some of them decided even that price was worth paying if it meant denying their enemies both their land and their spectacle of public death. The spoons. The warm hair. The perfect silence. These were not random. They were ritual. In folk magic of the period, magic the Puritans both feared and secretly consulted, such items carried potent sympathetic power. Hair was deeply personal, tied to the soul. Spoons, used for nourishment, symbolized taking or giving life. Arranged in a line, they may have formed a barrier, a summoning, or a contract. Whatever occurred in those final hours, it left the three men upstairs incapacitated by guilt, terror, and something that felt like divine judgment pressing down on their chests. When they finally forced the door open at dawn, the cell was empty, yet the air felt heavier than before, as though something vast had passed through and left a portion of itself behind. The women were never seen again in the flesh. But their absence spoke louder than any scream from the gallows ever could. And the land they once owned? It eventually passed to the very families who had accused them. Yet strange things began happening on that soil, crops failing in patterns, children born with unexplained marks, descendants plagued by nightmares of 9 silent women standing in a row, holding wooden spoons like offerings, or like accusations. This was not merely an escape. This was the beginning of a haunting that would echo through centuries of New England conscience. A haunting rooted in greed disguised as godliness. A haunting born when 9 women looked into the abyss, and the abyss looked back with a bargain. The night of June 28, 1692, did not simply pass over Salem village. It pressed down upon it like the hand of judgment. Upstairs in the jailer's cramped room, 3 men fought against an unnatural fog that had stolen into their blood. George Corwin lay on the rough floorboards, limbs heavy as lead, his mind drifting through thick, woolen dreams. Young John Putnam Jr. sat outside on the doorstep, weeping like a child for a mother long dead, his face wet with tears and vomit. Only Joseph Herrick retained a fragment of his Puritan will. He clutched his father's old Bible so tightly the leather cover left bruises on his palms. Over and over he recited the 23rd Psalm, the words falling from his lips like stones into a deep well. "The Lord is my shepherd." He said it 20 times. 30. But the words began to feel hollow, as though something in the cellar was swallowing their power. Sometime between midnight and 1 in the morning, Herrick heard it. First came the weeping. Not ordinary human weeping with its rises and falls, its choking sobs. This was a single, continuous low note, like a wet finger drawn slowly across the rim of a glass vial. A sound that drilled into the bones. It rose from directly beneath him, from the stone throat of the cellar. 9 voices braided together in quiet, endless grief. The sound of souls realizing too late what they had agreed to. Then, without warning, the weeping transformed. The women began to laugh. It was not mad cackling. Not the shrieking of the possessed. It was quiet, companionable laughter, the gentle, knowing laughter of old friends sharing a small joke over hearth fire and bread on an ordinary afternoon. The kind of laughter that once filled kitchens across Essex County before fear and accusation poisoned every hearth. That laughter drifting up through the floorboards was more terrifying than any scream. Because it sounded free. Then came the silence. A silence so complete it felt alive. A silence that had weight. Herrick would later swear on his deathbed that he never rose from his chair, never unbolted the heavy oak door, never descended those narrow, treacherous stairs. But in his final hours, racked with fever and guilt, he confessed the first great lie of his life. He had gone down. He had seen something his tongue could never fully name. And the memory of it had followed him for the rest of his days like a second shadow. Dawn arrived cold and gray on the morning of June 29. The first birds called hesitantly from the elms as if afraid to break the lingering spell. Corwin, stiff and hollow-eyed, took the ring of keys from the peg. His hands shook so badly the metal sang a jag at him. He descended the stairs, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the void. He unlocked the heavy oak door. The cell was empty. The ankle chains lay neatly coiled beside their iron rings in the wall, unlocked, not broken. The keys to those chains still hung upstairs behind a bolted inner door. The narrow window remained shuttered and barred, too small for any living woman to pass. No footprints in the damp earth. No torn clothing. No blood. No signs of struggle. In the exact center of the stone floor lay 9 wooden spoons arranged in a perfect, evenly spaced row. Every handle pointed directly toward the door, as though the women had left them as a final message or a final claim. Beside the spoons rested the small pile of freshly cut hair, still slightly warm, strands of brown, black, and gray tangled together like a covenant signed in the body itself. Corwin sat down hard on the cold stone. He did not move for nearly an hour. When he finally rose, he climbed the stairs like an old man and told the others. The three of them stood in the jailer's room in perfect silence, the kind of silence that settles between men who now share a terrible secret with the dark. It was Herrick who spoke first, his voice hoarse. "We must agree now on what we saw, before anyone else is told." And so the lie was born. In the decades that followed, the larger horror of the Salem trials swallowed this incident whole. The 9 women faded from public memory, spoken of only in whispers among certain bloodlines, usually behind locked doors, usually after dark. Their families scattered like seeds in a storm. By 1697, 5 of the 9 families had relocated under new or altered names. 3 to Connecticut, 1 to New York, 1 to the harsh settlements of what is now southern Maine. The Osgoods remained in Andover but abandoned organized worship for decades, only returning in the 1730s to a different denomination in a different town, under a minister who knew nothing of their haunted past. The Cloyce family petitioned relentlessly for the return of their property until 1699, when Sarah's husband Peter died suddenly of what the physician called a softening of the brain, a phrase that would echo ominously through later accounts in this story. After his death, the petition stopped. 2 families vanished so completely from the records that it defies explanation. These were families who had lived in Massachusetts since the 1630s, leaving clear documentary trails, tax rolls, church memberships, militia lists, deeds. After the summer of 1692, nothing. It was not mere forgetting. It was erasure. Deliberate, surgical removal from the historical record, leaving only a negative space where living people should have been. Yet something else survived. Land. In January 1693, 9 parcels of disputed borderland between Salem Village and Andover were quietly transferred to new owners. Every single buyer was closely tied by blood or business to Thomas Putnam, one of the most aggressive accusers of the entire trials, a man whose handwriting stained complaint after complaint. The deeds bore the marks of the original owners, the 9 women. But here is where the mystery deepens into something spiritually chilling. Several of these women, Mary Osgood and Abigail Faulkner among them, were literate. Mary had signed parish documents in her own clear hand just months earlier. Yet on these deeds they signed only with simple crosses. When a suspicious clerk compared those crosses decades later to the marks the women had made on their original accusation documents, they matched exactly down to the angle of intersection and the slight hook at the end of the lower stroke. The clerk, Ebenezer Bodie, died within a week, falling down the stairs of his own home. In his final days he wandered the house at night, muttering about crosses, signatures, and a cellar he had never visited. His widow fled with nothing but a small wooden box she would let no one touch. This was no ordinary real estate transaction. In Puritan eyes, land was not mere dirt and timber. It was inheritance, covenant, divine stewardship. To steal it through false witness was to invite the curse of Ahab, the judgment of Naboth's vineyard. Blood cried out from that soil for generations. The investigation into the deeper truth began quietly in 1710, when the Massachusetts General Court began reversing some attainders and offering restitution. The families of the 9 women never claimed it. Not one. Samuel Sewell, magistrate, signer of death warrants, and later public penitent who stood silently in Old South Meeting House while his pastor read his repentance, could not rest. He made private inquiries. What he discovered disturbed him to the end of his life. The Osgood family in Andover refused to speak of Mary. The man who met Sewell at the door had the eyes of someone who had made an unmaking bargain. Sewell recognized that look from survivors of the Deerfield massacre, men who had watched their children die and now lived every day knowing worse things waited if they ever broke their silence. The relocated families had arrived in their new homes with impossible wealth. Farms worth £60 suddenly produced silver enough to buy £215 worth £300 properties outright. One family started an iron foundry. Another opened an import business in New York that grew rapidly and entangled with Putnam-connected merchant houses. The money had appeared overnight, as if delivered by unseen hands. Then came the most haunting testimony of all. In her final illness, an old woman who had once served in the Putnam household sent for Sewell. On the morning of June 29, 1692, she had watched from the kitchen window as a covered cart left the Putnam farm at first light. Thomas Putnam himself drove it. Two riders flanked it, faces hidden in the gray dawn. In the back lay 9 bundles that looked like folded laundry. But the bundles breathed. 9 separate rhythms rising and falling, not quite in unison. Living cargo under canvas. The old woman had kept silent for 39 years. When she finally spoke, the words tore out of her like confession under divine pressure. 2 nights after telling Sewell, she died of a stoppage of the heart. The minister who had arranged the meeting died 3 weeks later after falling from his horse on a road he knew by heart. These were not coincidences. They were echoes of divine justice or something darker keeping its bargain. What happened in that cellar was never a simple escape. It was a transaction. 9 women, facing the rope at dawn, chose a different path. They offered something, perhaps their names, their public deaths, their future testimony, in exchange for life and the preservation of their family's material future. Hair and spoons left behind as sympathetic tokens. Signatures reduced to crosses so that even in their absence, the legal transfer could be completed. But bargains with the unseen always demand interest. The land gained by the Putnams yielded strange fruit in later generations, failed crops in perfect circles, children born with unexplained marks, nightmares of 9 silent women holding wooden spoons like both offering and accusation. The descendants learned to stay silent. Some changed names. Some moved. But the weight followed. Because in the theology these people lived and died by, there is no true escape from covenant, whether made with God or with the shadow that opposes him. Only different kinds of chains. Some chains are iron and visible. Others are made of land, of silence, of warm hair on cold stone, and of laughter that turns to weeping when the sun finally rises. And those chains, they still whisper in certain old houses in New England when the wind blows from the east and the frogs sing loud in the marshes. The truth about that night did not die with the 3 men who guarded the jail. It only went underground, buried in guilty silence, locked drawers, and bloodlines heavy with unspoken covenants. Samuel Sewell, the magistrate who once helped send innocent souls toward the gallows and later stood weeping in public repentance, could not let the matter rest. He investigated quietly for years, driven by a conscience that tormented him like an invisible familiar. But he never published a word. The implications were too explosive. Powerful families, some still holding seats in the general court, pulpits, magistracies, and Boston counting houses, had too much to lose. Instead, Sewell recorded everything in a private notebook bound in good calf leather. In the 1720s he placed it in a locked drawer in his Boston library. He instructed his son, and his son's son, that the drawer must never be opened while any living person could read it. If the house ever left the family, the entire contents were to be burned unopened. 2 generations kept that vow. The notebook slept until 1843. A great-great-grandson, Jonathan Sewell Rogers, a young Harvard divinity student, broke the lock searching for a sermon on the 90th Psalm. What he found instead changed the trajectory of his short life. Tucked between pages of Sewell's careful handwriting lay a single folded sheet of parchment. It was not in Sewell's hand. It was an affidavit dictated in 1717 by Constable Joseph Herrick on his deathbed. Herrick, then 70, his body wasted by a sickness of the bones, had summoned Reverend Joseph Garish in Wenham. He demanded the confession remain sealed until after his death. The Reverend, seeing the man's hour was near, agreed. In trembling words, Herrick confessed the lie he had carried for 25 years. He had not stayed upstairs as he once swore. Sometime after the unnatural laughter faded into that terrible silence, he was drawn downward. Against Corwin's orders and the screaming voice of his own conscience, he crept down the narrow cellar stairs in stocking feet, his father's Bible clutched like a shield. No lantern. Only darkness and the faint pull of something he could not name. At the bottom, the heavy oak door stood slightly ajar. A pale, steady light, steadier than any candle, leaked through the gap. The ankle chains lay neatly coiled on the stone floor, unlocked. And inside the cell stood 3 men. Thomas Putnam, lantern in hand, wore the expression of a farmer tallying livestock before market. Cold. Calculating. Satisfied. Slightly behind him stood a figure Herrick recognized by voice and bearing, a high official of Essex County, still wearing the same coat he had worn on the bench days earlier. The man's hands were clasped, his posture formal, as though this midnight transaction were merely another court proceeding. The third man was a stranger. He wore a dark travel cloak. His face remained in shadow, something Herrick, even on his deathbed under the approaching judgment of God, could not bring himself to describe in full. This man carried a leather satchel the size of a small traveling bag. And the satchel moved. It rose and fell in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Not quite human breathing. There were pauses too long for lungs, quickenings too sudden. Whatever lived inside it had its own unnatural pulse. The stranger held the bag with the weary familiarity of someone who had carried such burdens many times before. The 9 women sat in a silent row on the cold stone floor. Wrists bound together with ordinary-looking rope that made no sound when moved. Bare feet. Open eyes. Every single one of them turned their gaze at the exact same moment toward Herrick hiding in the shadows at the foot of the stairs. 9 pairs of eyes. Not frightened. Not angry. Simply. Herrick fled back upstairs on silent feet. He lay on the floor beside the drugged Corwin and the weeping young Putnam, pretending sleep. Later he heard the oak door close, the bolt slide home from the outside, footsteps on the stairs, the outer jail door opening, and the creak of a cart on the muddy track. He kept his silence for 25 years. That silence cost him his health, his peace, and the warmth of his wife, who knew from the first week of July 1692 that her husband carried a darkness he would not share. She withdrew into her own silence until death. Jonathan Sewell Rogers transcribed the affidavit and wrote to 3 respected New England scholars. Within a year, all 4 men were dead. Rogers drowned in the Charles River in November 1844, officially suicide, though his body bore unexplained bruises on the wrists and back of the neck. One scholar died of a sudden fever while investigating records in Andover. Another, a clergyman, was found dead at the base of his own locked church bell tower. The third wasted away from a softening of the brain, the same phrase used for earlier victims in this chain. In his final weeks he sat staring into the fire, weeping, and would lift his wrist to show his wife a small mark shaped like a cross that had appeared months earlier. It never faded. Sometimes it darkened for no reason. The original affidavit disappeared. The notebook itself eventually reached the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1879, where scholars can still request it. But the most damning document has never been seen again by the public. What does remain in the Essex County archives is the sealed box labeled simply June 29, 1692, incident. In 1922, archivist Edith Pierce opened it as part of a cataloging project. Her professional description, the only one made by trained eyes, is haunting. 9 blank parchment sheets, each bearing a single cross in the lower right corner, identical to the marks the women made on their accusation documents. 1 iron ankle ring, its lock partially melted by intense heat no source in the unheated cellar could have produced. The metal showed a crystalline structure formed only when iron is heated near melting and cooled rapidly. A small pile of human hair, braided into 9 tight plates, each bound with strands of itself. After more than 2 centuries, the hair showed no decay. A county physician who examined it privately wrote that it had the unmistakable appearance of haircut from living heads, not corpses. A small leather pouch containing 9 wooden spoons carved from the same piece of wood. Each handle marked with a single letter of the alphabet. Together they formed a Latin acronym from a medieval Roman rite for the anointing of the dying, let them go in peace. 3 weeks after receiving that scholarly confirmation, Edith Pierce resigned. She returned to rural Vermont and never spoke of her Massachusetts work again. Until her death in 1963, she kept a small wooden box on her mantel that no one was allowed to touch. Her nephew, honoring her wishes, placed it unopened into her coffin. This pattern of silence, sudden death, and hidden objects repeats like a curse across centuries, evidence of a bargain whose terms were never fully honorable. In the spring of 2007, a family in East Hartford, Connecticut, cleaning out a 9-generation attic, made a discovery that brings this story into the present day. The house had been purchased in autumn 1693 by a couple calling themselves Thomas and Mary Barker. They arrived from Massachusetts with considerable silver and a vague story of family loss they preferred not to discuss. They paid cash, £215, for the property and lived quiet, reserved lives. Devout but never fully at ease in the meeting house. Generous in small things, intensely private in large ones. What the family found in that attic suggests the bargain made in the Salem cellar still casts a long shadow. The descendants had tried to outrun it by changing names and moving, but some debts refused to be left behind. The spiritual weight here is crushing. In the Puritan worldview these people inhabited, every soul stands in covenant either with the God of Scripture or with something that mimics light while carrying darkness. False witness for land. Trading public death for private survival. Signing with crosses instead of names. Leaving hair and spoons as tokens. These were not mere superstitions. They were attempts to manipulate spiritual realities for material gain. And such attempts, Scripture warns, always demand payment in the end, sometimes from the guilty, often from their children's children. The 9 women did not simply vanish. They stepped sideways into a different kind of chain. Their accusers gained land but inherited something far heavier. The witnesses who glimpsed the transaction carried it as guilt until it killed them. Even later researchers found that some knowledge is not meant for the living. The cellar that night was not merely a prison. It became a courtroom of another kind. A place where desperate souls weighed earthly rope against eternal consequence. Where greed met its mirror image in the form of a moving satchel and 9 pairs of knowing eyes. And the verdict of that night still echoes: some doors, once unbolted from the inside, can never truly be locked again. Some truths are too heavy for daylight. They must be locked inside cedar chests, passed through bloodlines like forbidden heirlooms, and guarded by promises sealed with fear and gratitude. In East Hartford, Connecticut, a family preserving a 9-generation home discovered such a chest in the spring of 2007. According to Mary Barker's will from 1729, the chest was never to be opened in the lifetime of anyone who had known her. It was to be kept as a remembrance of a time of great trouble from which I was delivered by the mercy of God and by the charity of a friend whose name I could not write. Inside, beneath Civil War papers, love letters, christening gowns, and a folded 1980s wedding dress, rested a small bound volume wrapped in ancient linen. The cover was not leather. A Yale conservator's private report, never published, concluded the material was human dermis, tanned in late 17th century New England style. Organic. Unmistakable. The pages held the careful, elegant handwriting of a literate woman born in the 1630s. The diary opened with a single name written in full, defiant and sacred. Mary Osgood. She began writing on July 1, 1692, 2 days after she and 8 other women disappeared from a bolted Salem jail cell, and 3 days after they were scheduled to hang at dawn on Gallows Hill. This was no ordinary journal. It was a quiet act of survival. A woman rewriting her soul under a new name, in a new land, carrying the weight of a bargain she could never fully confess. Mary described the long, hard winter of 1692-93 in Connecticut. The slow stitching together of a new life. She wrote of learning to love Thomas Barker, the widower she married by arrangement 6 weeks after arrival. A gentleman who never asked about her past and who accepted her night terrors with patient silence. She wrote of spinning wool by firelight, of baking bread, of a neighbor woman who brought apples and asked no dangerous questions. She described meeting the other 8 women in scattered kitchens across the Connecticut River Valley, always under innocent pretexts, always speaking only of butter, children, weather, and the quality of the new soil. Once, in February 1693, she and Sarah, almost certainly Sarah Cloyce, sat by a hearth in a Wethersfield farmhouse. They wept for a full hour without speaking a word, without touching, without looking at each other. Just 2 women staring into flames, grieving what they could never name. Then, as if by unspoken signal, they dried their eyes and spoke again of ordinary things. The visit continued. The silence held. Only once did Mary allow the truth onto the page. On November 10, 1692, she described the man in the dark travel cloak. He had entered their cell after midnight on the 28th of June, accompanied by Thomas Putnam and a high official she called only the gentleman. The stranger spoke with the voice of a very old man, yet moved with unnatural ease. He addressed each woman by her true baptismal name, not the names of accusation. He offered them a choice, one by one, with chilling gentleness. Stay and hang at dawn. Or go with him, receive new names, new husbands, new homes, and silver enough to begin again. The price was total silence. Not just for themselves, but for every descendant their blood would ever produce. They must never speak of the cell, the village, their old names, or the true purpose behind the trials. If any of them, or their children's children, ever broke that silence, the bargain would shatter and the price would be collected. He did not need to name the price. Each woman already carried her deepest terror in her own heart. The man explained the machinery behind Salem with clinical calm. The hangings were public theater necessary to stain the land and its families with permanent shame so no one would contest the titles. The true goal was the quiet transfer of roughly 4,000 acres of prime disputed farmland into new hands. The disappearances were reserved for women too respected, too well connected to hang without creating martyrs and dangerous inquiries. For them, absence was more useful than death. The land itself needed to be remembered as cursed. Mary wrote that the man's voice never rose. He spoke as one stating simple facts, like a merchant closing accounts. When she asked about the ninth woman among them, he gave no answer. But she saw his satchel move rising and falling with that same unnatural rhythm Herrick had described on his deathbed. The diary contains no further references to the cloak, the cellar, or the missing ninth woman. Only the small, determined chronicle of a woman planting gardens, watching apple trees bloom, and daring to hope she was with child. Her final entry, written in May 1693, reads with heartbreaking simplicity. I have planted the garden today. Thomas has built a new gate. The apple trees are in flower. I believe I am with child. May God forgive us all. The Osgood diary remains in private hands. The family has refused scholarly access, honoring the wishes of an elderly relative. Partial transcriptions exist in narrow academic circles, but both doctoral students who worked on it withdrew their dissertations before publication. Both are alive. Both changed fields. Neither will speak of it. Meanwhile, the sealed box in Essex County still holds its relics exactly as Edith Pierce described them in 1922, 9 blank parchments with identical crosses, 1 partially melted iron ankle ring, 9 braided locks of hair that refused to decay, and 9 wooden spoons spelling a medieval Latin plea for the dying, let them go in peace. The 9 parcels of land changed hands over the centuries. Today they host a shopping mall, a private school, cemeteries, a highway, and an industrial park whose owners never seem to stay alone. No ghost stories cling to them. No markers remember what happened. The forgetting itself feels orchestrated, thorough, patient, and complete. This is the deeper horror of Salem. Beneath the visible madness of spectral evidence, convulsing girls, and screaming accusations lay a colder, more patient operation. A transaction in land, power, and silence. A second horror interested not in souls but in deeds and titles. One that used fear of the devil as perfect cover for very human greed. In biblical terms, it echoes the worst sins of Israel, shedding innocent blood for vineyards, bearing false witness for inheritance, and making covenants with darkness while claiming the name of God. Such bargains never end cleanly. They echo through bloodlines. They demand interest paid in silence, in erased names, in cedar chests that must never be opened, and in descendants who learn never to ask certain questions. Mary Osgood and the 8 tried to buy life with silence. They received new homes, new children, and years they would otherwise have lost on the gallows. But every night some of them woke weeping. Every generation since has carried the instruction, speak and the price will be collected. And somewhere in the story remains the 9th woman. The one who did not travel with the others to Connecticut. The one about whom the man in the cloak gave no answer, only the movement in his satchel. Some bargains require a different kind of payment. What began as 9 wooden spoons in a perfect row on cold stone has become a meditation on how easily evil hides behind the machinery of righteousness. How land can be bought with blood and silence. How some prisons have no bars, only covenants passed from mother to child with the warning, never speak the old names. The frogs still sing in the marshes near Old Salem. The wind still carries salt from the Atlantic. And in certain old houses, when the night is heavy and the clocks strike low, some descendants still check the locks on cedar chests they have never dared open. Because forgetting was the first duty they were asked to perform. And some duties, once accepted, bind deeper than iron chains. This was never only about witches. It was about what men will do when they believe no one is watching from heaven. It was about how cheaply some will sell their neighbor's life, and how expensively others will buy their own. The cellar door closed that night. But something inside it never truly left. What do you believe happened to the ninth woman? Do you think every descendant kept the silence? Or does the satchel still move somewhere, waiting for the bargain to be tested? Leave your thoughts below. The ones brave enough to speak may be the ones who finally break the oldest curse of all.